November 8, 1960. The American people went to bed not knowing who their next president would be. In one of the closest elections in United States history, Senator John F. Kennedy appeared to edge out Vice President Richard Nixon by the thinnest of margins. But as dawn broke on November 9th, whispers began circulating through Republican circles. Something wasn't right in Chicago. Something felt off in Texas. And yet, 3 days later, Nixon would do something extraordinary. He would concede an election that many believed was stolen from him. This is the story of why Nixon refused to contest the 1960 election, even though he knew Kennedy stole it, but stayed silent. And it's a story that still resonates today as one of the most controversial moments in American political history. The stage was set long before that fateful November night. The 1960 presidential campaign was unlike anything America had ever witnessed. It was the first election of the television age, the first where Catholic faith became a central issue, and the first where both major candidates were born in the 20th century. Richard Nixon, the 47-year-old vice president, represented experience and continuity. He had served under Dwight Eisenhower for 8 years, navigated the treacherous waters of Cold War politics, and famously stood toe-to-toe with Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev in the kitchen debate. John F. Kennedy, at 43, was the young senator from Massachusetts with movie star looks, a wealthy family behind him, and ambitions that seemed to know no bounds. Nixon entered the race as the favorite. Most political observers assumed he would win. After all, Eisenhower's presidency had been largely successful. The country was relatively prosperous, and Nixon had proven himself capable on the world stage. He had name recognition, political experience, and the backing of an administration that remained popular with the American people. But Kennedy had something else entirely. He had vision, youth, and perhaps most importantly, he understood the power of the new medium that would change politics forever. On September 26, 1960, something historic happened that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of the race. The first televised presidential debate took place in a Chicago television studio. An estimated 70 million Americans tuned in, nearly 90% of homes with televisions. It was a moment that would be dissected and analyzed for decades to come, not just for what was said, but for how the candidates appeared. Nixon arrived at the studio already at a disadvantage. He had been campaigning relentlessly, traveling to all 50 states as he had promised. Just weeks before, he had injured his knee and spent time in the hospital, losing about 15 pounds in the process. He looked gaunt and exhausted. That day before the debate, Nixon made several campaign stops around Chicago, including speaking at a carpenters union event. When he arrived at the television station and climbed out of his car, he slammed his bad knee against the doorframe, causing him excruciating pain. Kennedy, meanwhile, had spent the previous week in careful preparation. He conducted mock debates with advisors, studied Nixon's speaking patterns, and made sure he was well rested. He arrived at the studio hours early to check the conditions, the lighting, and even the temperature of the room. He had a natural tan from campaigning in California. When offered television makeup, Kennedy refused it, but only after his own team had already applied subtle touches. Nixon, overhearing that Kennedy had turned down makeup, felt compelled to refuse it as well. The last thing he wanted was headlines reading, "Nixon takes makeup, Kennedy refuses it." Instead, he agreed only to a light coating of a product called Lazy Shave, mainly designed to hide his notorious 5 o'clock shadow. The visual contrast was devastating. Kennedy wore a dark suit that stood out sharply against the light studio background. Nixon wore a light gray suit that seemed to fade into the set, making him appear almost ghost-like on black and white television screens. As the debate progressed, Nixon began sweating under the hot studio lights, and the minimal makeup seemed to melt away, revealing beads of perspiration on his face. Chicago Mayor Richard Daley, watching the broadcast, reportedly remarked, "My God, they've embalmed him before he even died." The next day, the Chicago Daily News ran the headline, "Was Nixon sabotaged by TV makeup artists?" But it wasn't just cosmetics. There were fundamental differences in how the two men approached the medium. Kennedy looked directly into the camera, speaking to viewers at home as if he were in their living rooms. Nixon, trained in traditional debate tactics, looked at the moderator and reporters off to the side, appearing to avoid eye contact with the audience. For a man already known as Tricky Dick, this was disastrous. Studies conducted immediately after the debate revealed a fascinating split. Those who listened on radio generally thought Nixon had won based on the substance of his arguments. But those who watched on television, the vast majority, believed Kennedy was the clear victor. Kennedy had won not through superior policy positions, but through superior understanding of the new medium. The debates shifted momentum in Kennedy's direction, but the race remained incredibly tight. Nixon had started with a 6-point lead in national polls before the debates. By Election Day, most polls showed the race as a virtual tie. Both campaigns understood that the outcome would likely come down to a handful of crucial swing states. Among them, two stood out as particularly vital: Illinois with its 27 electoral votes and Texas with 24. If Kennedy could win both states, he would almost certainly win the presidency. If Nixon could flip just those two states, he would be president. What neither candidate could have fully anticipated was how the battle for these states would become mired in accusations of fraud, stolen ballots, and political machines operating in the shadows. Let's talk about Illinois first, because this is where the story gets really interesting. Chicago in 1960 was not just any American city. It was the crown jewel of urban political machines, controlled by one of the most powerful political bosses in American history, Mayor Richard J. Daley. Daley wasn't just the mayor, he was also the chairman of the Cook County Democratic Party Central Committee, giving him control over an organization that had been perfected over decades. The Chicago Democratic Machine, as it was known, was a marvel of political organization and, critics would say, corruption. The way it worked was elegantly simple. The machine controlled government patronage jobs. These jobs went to precinct captains and party workers who had one primary responsibility: deliver votes. And deliver they did, through a combination of legitimate organizing, voter mobilization, and methods that fell well outside the bounds of legality. The machine operated on a system of favors. Need your garbage picked up promptly? Vote for our candidate. Want your relative to get a city job? Vote for our candidate. Need a permit for your business? Well, you know what to do. For those less willing to cooperate voluntarily, there were other methods. Precincts were organized down to the block level, with captains who knew every resident, every voter, and every family situation. On Election Day, the machine could move voters to the polls with military precision. Critics alleged far more sinister activities: dead people voting, individuals casting ballots multiple times, names taken from gravestones and cemeteries to pad registration rolls, and outright intimidation of voters who might lean Republican. When the votes were counted in Illinois on election night, the results were almost too close to comprehend. Out of 4.75 million votes cast statewide, Kennedy won by fewer than 9,000 votes. That's a margin of 0.2%. Nixon carried 92 of Illinois's 101 counties, sweeping through downstate and suburban areas. But Chicago delivered for Kennedy in spectacular fashion. In Cook County, which includes Chicago, Kennedy won by more than 450,000 votes. That massive urban plurality more than offset Nixon's victories across the rest of the state. Republicans immediately cried foul. How could Kennedy's margin in Chicago be so enormous? The allegations came fast and furious. In some precincts, more votes were cast than there were registered voters. Dead people appeared to have risen from their graves to vote Democratic. In one particularly egregious case, a completely gutted house with no residents recorded 56 votes for Kennedy. One reporter found a cemetery where names on tombstones had been registered and voted. When investigators examined voter registration rolls against actual addresses, they found person after person who supposedly voted, but had either moved away, died, or in some cases never existed at all. Earl Mazo, a reporter for the New York Herald Tribune and Nixon's biographer, launched his own investigation. What he found was damning. Mazo told the Washington Post years later, "There was a cemetery where the names on the tombstones were registered and voted. I remember a house. It was completely gutted. There was nobody there, but there were 56 votes for Kennedy in that house." Mazo also investigated Republican areas in southern Illinois and found voter fraud there too, but he concluded that the Republican fraud did not match the Chicago fraud he found. The Chicago Tribune, which had routinely endorsed Republican presidential candidates, conducted its own investigation. Their conclusion was stark. The election of November 8th was characterized by such gross and palpable fraud as to justify the conclusion that Nixon was deprived of victory. The Republican National Committee filed lawsuits and demanded recounts. A special prosecutor was assigned to investigate the allegations. Eventually, charges were brought against 650 election officials. But here's where the machine's power truly showed itself. The case was assigned to Circuit Court Judge Tommy Kluczynski, widely known as a Daily Machine loyalist. Later, Kennedy would appoint Kluczynski to the federal bench, on Mayor Daley's recommendation. Of the 650 charged, 647 were acquitted. Only 3 Chicago election workers were eventually convicted of voter fraud in 1962, and they served short jail sentences. A massive recount effort was launched. Ben Adamowski, a Republican who had lost his re-election bid for Cook County State's attorney to a Democrat, requested a recount of that race. Republicans couldn't order a direct recount of the presidential results, but they hoped that a recount of the state's attorney race would expose the fraud in the presidential contest as well. The recount revealed fascinating patterns. When examining precincts in 6 towns around Chicago, errors of 10 votes or more in favor of Kennedy occurred in 3.1% of precincts. Errors in favor of Nixon occurred in 2.6%. In Chicago itself, 11% of precincts had errors of 10 votes or more in Kennedy's favor, while 8.6% had errors in Nixon's favor. Kennedy's vote was overcounted in 38% of Chicago's precincts. Curiously, Nixon's vote was overcounted in 40%. The recount ultimately increased Nixon's total by 926 votes, nowhere near enough to change the outcome. The Republican-dominated State Board of Elections, after reviewing all the evidence, unanimously rejected the challenge to the results. But here's the crucial detail that often gets lost in the mythology. Even if Nixon had won Illinois, it would not have been enough to win him the presidency. Kennedy would still have had 276 electoral votes, 6 more than the 270 needed to win. To actually flip the election, Nixon would have needed to win Illinois and Texas. And Texas is where the story gets even murkier. Texas in 1960 was a very different place than Illinois. While Chicago had a well-organized political machine, Texas had something else entirely. A political culture where election irregularities were so common, they were almost accepted as normal. The state's modern election system with proper safeguards was still developing. Voter fraud wasn't unusual, it was practically traditional, and Kennedy had a massive advantage in Texas. His running mate was Lyndon Baines Johnson, the Senate Majority Leader, and one of the most powerful politicians in the state. Johnson hadn't been Kennedy's first choice for vice president. In fact, Kennedy and his brother Bobby had significant reservations about LBJ. But the political calculus was undeniable. Texas had 24 electoral votes. The state was crucial, and Johnson could deliver it. Johnson's reputation for political maneuvering was well established. His nickname, Landslide Lyndon, came from his razor-thin victory in the 1948 Democratic Senate primary, a race shrouded in allegations of fraud. In that election, Johnson had appeared to lose to former Governor Coke Stevenson. 6 days after the polls closed, a new ballot box was discovered in Jim Wells County. Box 13, as it became known in history, contained 202 previously uncounted votes, 200 for Johnson and just 2 for Stevenson. This gave Johnson victory by exactly 87 votes out of 988 torn down to 195 cast. Investigators later found that the last 202 names in the precinct's poll book were written in alphabetical order in the same handwriting. When some of these supposed voters were interviewed, they claimed they hadn't voted at all. In 1907, almost 30 years later, Luis Salas, the election judge who had certified Box 13, admitted in a taped interview with Associated Press reporter James W. Mangan, Johnson did not win that election. It was stolen for him, and I know exactly how it was done. So when Kennedy chose Johnson as his running mate for the 1960 presidential race, Republicans knew they were facing someone with both the skills and the willingness to use whatever methods necessary to deliver Texas. And deliver he did. Kennedy won Texas by 46,000 votes out of more than 2 million cast. But the margin was immediately suspicious to Republicans. Earl Mazo, the same reporter who investigated Illinois, turned his attention to Texas. What he found was disturbing. In Fannin County, which had only 4,095 registered voters, a total of 6,138 votes were cast. 3/4 of them went for Kennedy. That's more votes than registered voters in the entire county. In one Angelina County precinct, Kennedy received 187 votes to Nixon's 24, despite there being only 86 registered voters in the entire precinct. When asked how this was possible, Texas election officials pointed out that registered voter figures only counted people who had paid the poll tax, and veterans, senior citizens, and some other isolated groups were exempt. But this explanation didn't account for the massive discrepancies. The New York Herald Tribune's investigation concluded that a minimum of 100,000 votes for the Kennedy-Johnson ticket in Texas were fraudulent or highly questionable. When Republicans demanded a statewide recount, they discovered something that should surprise no one. The State Board of Elections, whose members were all Democrats, had already certified Kennedy as the winner of Texas. There would be no recount. The Republican challenges in Texas, like those in Illinois, went nowhere. The political machine, though different in character from Chicago's, was just as effective at protecting its gains. Now let's address a theory that has persisted for decades, one involving not just political machines, but organized crime. Some journalists and historians have claimed that mobster Sam Giancana and his Chicago outfit played a significant role in Kennedy's victory. The theory goes like this. Joseph P. Kennedy, JFK's father, met with Giancana before the election and struck a deal. The mob would help ensure Kennedy won Illinois, and in return, a Kennedy administration would lay off organized crime. Giancana, who controlled illegal gambling, liquor distribution, and various other rackets in Chicago, supposedly used his influence in several wards to stuff ballot boxes and intimidate voters. Frank Sinatra, who knew both JFK and Giancana, allegedly served as an intermediary. Some versions of the story claim that Giancana later bragged to his mistress, Judith Campbell Exner, that Kennedy would never have been elected without his help. Exner herself claimed to have been involved in passing messages between Kennedy and Giancana during the campaign. The story takes an even darker turn in its later chapters. According to this theory, the Kennedys double-crossed the mob. Robert Kennedy, appointed as Attorney General, launched an aggressive campaign against organized crime, targeting Giancana and other mob bosses. The mob felt betrayed, and in some versions of the story, this betrayal led to the assassination of both John and Robert Kennedy. It's a compelling narrative, one that's been featured in books, movies, and television shows. The problem is that when scholars have actually examined the evidence, the mob connection falls apart. A detailed academic study by researcher John Binder, published in the journal Public Choice in 2007, looked at voting patterns in wards supposedly controlled by the outfit. His findings were clear. There was no evidence that outfit-controlled wards or union members influenced by the outfit voted any more heavily Democratic than they normally did. The massive fraud in Chicago, such as it was, appeared to come from the regular Democratic political machine, not from mob intervention. The story of Joseph Kennedy making a deal with Giancana lacks credible documentation. Most of the allegations come from books written by Giancana's relatives, who had their own reasons to embellish his importance. FBI wiretaps and investigations from the period, which have since been released, show no evidence of such a deal. In fact, one prominent FBI historian who reviewed wiretap evidence from the period believed Illinois rightfully belonged to Nixon, but that conclusion was based on the regular political machine's activities, not mob interference. J. Edgar Hoover reportedly believed Nixon had actually won the presidency, but when the FBI's findings were referred to the Attorney General, who as of January 20, 1961 was Robert F. Kennedy, the case effectively died. The mob theory persists because it makes for great storytelling. It combines politics, organized crime, betrayal, and ultimately assassination. But most serious historians who have examined the actual evidence conclude that while there was certainly fraud in Chicago, and while the Chicago outfit may have preferred Kennedy, there's no credible evidence that the mob played a decisive or even significant role in stealing the election. So, we return to our central question. If there was fraud, if there were legitimate reasons to believe the election was stolen, why didn't Nixon contest it? The public story, the one Nixon told for years, is one of selfless statesmanship. According to Nixon's own account in his autobiography, he was urged by others, including President Eisenhower, to challenge the results. But Nixon claimed he refused. He explained his reasoning in his book, Six Crises. I could think of no worse example for nations abroad, who for the first time were trying to put free electoral procedures into effect, than that of the United States wrangling over the results of our presidential election. and even suggesting that the presidency itself could be stolen by thievery at the ballot box. Nixon told his friend Earl Mazo, the reporter investigating the fraud, that our country cannot afford the agony of a constitutional crisis. The context matters here. This was 1960, the height of the Cold War. Just months earlier, in May, an American U-2 spy plane piloted by Francis Gary Powers had been shot down over Soviet territory. The incident humiliated President Eisenhower and torpedoed a planned summit with Khrushchev in Paris. In Cuba, Fidel Castro had recently come to power, bringing communism to America's doorstep. The United States and Soviet Union were locked in a terrifying nuclear standoff, with both sides building arsenals capable of destroying human civilization. The space race was intensifying, with the Soviets having launched Sputnik and Americans feeling like they were falling behind. At home, the civil rights movement was gaining momentum, forcing America to confront its own failures of democracy and equality. In this context, Nixon argued, it was crucial that America present a united front to the world. A contested election, months of legal battles, accusations flying back and forth, would make American democracy look weak and dysfunctional. Nixon also had practical concerns about his own future. He explained in private that pursuing the fraud allegations would result in him being labeled a sore loser, which would follow me through history and remove any possibility of a further political career. This was Nixon thinking strategically. He was only 47 years old. If he contested the election and lost, he would be finished in politics. If he conceded gracefully, he could run again. He could position himself as the statesman who put country above personal ambition. It was vintage Nixon, calculating even in defeat, always thinking several moves ahead. 3 days after the election, on November 9th, Nixon sent Kennedy a telegram of congratulations. He said Kennedy would have the united support of all Americans. On November 14th, Nixon met with Kennedy in Key Biscayne, Florida, for an hour. Afterward, he told reporters he viewed their meeting as an example of how democracy works and the peaceful transition of power. On January 6, 1961, in one of the most poignant moments in American political history, Nixon presided over the counting of electoral votes in his capacity as vice president. Standing at the rostrum in the House of Representatives, he announced Kennedy's victory, making him, as he noted, the first time in 100 years that a candidate for the presidency announced the results of an election in which he was defeated and announced the victory of his opponent. But here's what most people don't know. Nixon's public posture of not contesting the election was to a significant degree a facade. While Nixon himself stayed publicly silent, the Republican Party waged an aggressive campaign to overturn the results. Republican National Committee Chairman Thurston Ballard Morton refused to concede and immediately launched investigations. Morton dispatched teams of GOP operatives to 8 states: Illinois, New Jersey, Texas, Missouri, New Mexico, Nevada, South Carolina, and Pennsylvania. He announced the creation of what he called the National Recount and Fair Elections Committee. Morton himself traveled to Chicago to personally oversee the effort. The party obtained court orders for recounts, empaneled grand juries, and got U.S. attorneys and the FBI involved. They filed lawsuits, challenged results, gathered evidence, and fought in courts across multiple states. This went on not for days or weeks, but for months, continuing into 1961. So, Nixon's claim that he chose not to contest the election isn't entirely accurate. What's more accurate is that Nixon chose to stay publicly above the fray while his allies fought the battles for him. If they succeeded in overturning the results, Nixon could claim the presidency. If they failed, he could maintain his image as the gracious loser who respected the democratic process. It was a brilliant political strategy, but it wasn't the pure act of statesmanship that Nixon portrayed. Historian David Greenberg has documented this extensively. In fact, Greenberg argues that the popular narrative of Nixon as the selfless statesman who refused to contest a stolen election is largely a myth. The reality is more complex. Nixon encouraged the challenges behind the scenes while maintaining deniability in public. At a Christmas party in December 1960, Nixon was overheard greeting guests with, "We won, but they stole it from us." It wasn't until mid-1961, after all the Republican challenges had failed, that the matter was finally put to rest. By then, Nixon had preserved his political future while still allowing his party to fight for what they believed was justice. So, Did Kennedy steal the election? The honest answer is that we'll probably never know with complete certainty. What we do know is this: there was definitely fraud in Chicago. The evidence is overwhelming. Dead people voted, phantom voters appeared on rolls, ballot boxes were stuffed, and the political machine operated with brazen disregard for electoral integrity. The question is whether the fraud was large enough to flip Illinois. Most modern historians who have studied the evidence carefully, including Edmund Kalina, who wrote the most comprehensive academic study of the Illinois recount, conclude that while fraud occurred, it's not clear it was sufficient to change the outcome. The recount showed errors that favored both candidates, and the net effect wasn't large enough to flip the state. Moreover, there's credible evidence that Republicans engaged in fraud downstate, though on a smaller scale. In Texas, the situation is murkier because the entire election system was less developed and reliable. Fraud almost certainly occurred, but Texas was a Democratic state where Kennedy might have won legitimately anyway, given that he had LBJ on the ticket. Even Earl Mazo's investigation, which found massive irregularities, couldn't definitively prove that enough fraud occurred to flip the state's outcome. And here's the crucial mathematical reality. Even if we assume Nixon was cheated out of Illinois, that alone wouldn't have given him the presidency. He needed Illinois and Texas. The odds of successfully overturning two large states in court, especially when one of them had an all-Democrat election board, were virtually zero. Nixon's lawyers understood this. The practical barriers to actually reversing the election were insurmountable. The 1960 election left scars that would shape American politics for decades. For Nixon personally, the experience was formative. He nursed a grudge about the stolen election for years. When he was later criticized for the Watergate crimes that ended his presidency in 1974, Nixon would point to the Kennedys' supposed theft in 1960 as precedent. He may have felt their theft entitled him to cheat in 1972, though of course that doesn't justify his actions. Some historians have wondered, if no cloud had hung over the 1960 election, would Watergate have happened? It's an impossible question to answer, but it's worth considering. The election also changed how campaigns are conducted. The televised debates made television the dominant medium for political communication. From 1960 onward, image and presentation became as important as substance and policy. Candidates needed to understand not just politics, but media. They needed to look presidential on camera, to speak in sound bites, to master the art of the photo opportunity. For better or worse, 1960 ushered in the modern era of presidential campaigns. The Catholic issue that had hung over Kennedy's campaign became less significant after his victory. Kennedy proved a Catholic could be elected president, opening doors for future candidates of all faiths. The focus on swing states and the Electoral College became more pronounced. Kennedy's strategy of targeting key states while largely ignoring others became a template that campaigns follow to this day. The fraud allegations, however they played out in reality, also contributed to a growing cynicism about politics and politicians. The idea that elections could be stolen, that political machines could manipulate democracy itself, undermined faith in the system. This cynicism would grow throughout the 1960s and 1970s as Americans witnessed political assassinations, the Vietnam War, civil rights struggles, and ultimately Watergate. The sense that the system was rigged, that powerful interests controlled outcomes regardless of how regular people voted, became embedded in American political culture. Let's also consider what happened to the major players in this drama. Kennedy, of course, went on to serve less than 3 years as president before his assassination in Dallas on November 22, 1963. His presidency included the Bay of Pigs disaster, the Cuban Missile Crisis where the world came closest to nuclear war, the beginning of America's deep involvement in Vietnam, and the acceleration of the civil rights movement. He became, in death, an icon, his presidency remembered as Camelot, even though the reality was more complicated. Lyndon Johnson assumed the presidency after Kennedy's death, and went on to win election in his own right in 1964 by a genuine landslide. He pushed through landmark civil rights legislation and Great Society programs, but became mired in Vietnam, ultimately choosing not to run for re-election in 1968. The Box 13 scandal from his 1948 Senate race followed him throughout his political career. Richard Daley remained Chicago's mayor until his death in 1976. dominating the city's politics for 21 years. The democratic machine he perfected gradually lost power after his death, but his son, Richard M. Daley, would later serve as mayor from 1989 to 2011, creating a Daley political dynasty. Sam Giancana, the alleged mob connection, continued to lead the Chicago outfit until 1966. He was murdered in 1975, shot multiple times in his home while cooking sausages, just days before he was scheduled to testify before a Senate committee about mob involvement in CIA plots to assassinate Fidel Castro. Many believe he was killed to prevent him from revealing secrets about the Kennedy assassination or other mob activities. And Nixon? After his gracious concession in 1960, Nixon attempted a comeback by running for governor of California in 1962. He lost that race and famously told the press, "You won't have Nixon to kick around anymore," announcing his retirement from politics. But Nixon never really retired. He moved to New York, practiced law, and quietly rebuilt his political network. In 1968, he ran for president again and won, defeating Hubert Humphrey in another close race. He was re-elected in 1972 in one of the biggest landslides in American history, winning 49 states. But his second term was cut short by the Watergate scandal. Facing certain impeachment, Nixon resigned on August 9, 1974, the only president in American history to do so. He spent his remaining years trying to rehabilitate his reputation, writing books and serving as an elder statesman on foreign policy issues. He died in '94 at age 81. The question of whether Nixon could have successfully contested the 1960 election if he had tried deserves examination. Legally, his options were limited. Each state had different election laws, and some had no provisions for recounts at all. A successful challenge would have required overturning results in multiple states simultaneously, each with its own legal process and timeline. The logistics alone were daunting. The safe harbor deadline for the Electoral College to meet was December 19th. That gave Nixon just 6 weeks from Election Day to investigate, gather evidence, file lawsuits, obtain recounts, go through appeals, and somehow reverse the results in 2 large states. It was, practically speaking, impossible. Even if Nixon had won both Illinois and Texas in court, which was vanishingly unlikely, the political cost would have been enormous. The country would have been thrown into chaos. Kennedy had been declared the winner by the media and had begun planning his transition to power. World leaders had congratulated him. To reverse that outcome through legal challenges would have been seen as a Republican attempt to overturn the will of the people, regardless of whether fraud had actually occurred. Nixon would have entered the presidency under a cloud of illegitimacy that might have made it impossible to govern effectively. In the context of the Cold War, with America needing to project strength and unity against the Soviet threat, a constitutional crisis over the election could have been disastrous for national security. So, Nixon's decision, while perhaps not as purely noble as he portrayed it, was likely the correct one from both a practical and political standpoint. He couldn't win a legal battle to overturn the results, and attempting to do so would have destroyed whatever political future he might have. Better to concede gracefully, maintain his dignity, and live to fight another day. And in the end, that strategy worked. Nixon did make a comeback and did eventually win the presidency, even if he ultimately destroyed himself through his own paranoia and illegal activities. The 1960 election remains one of the most fascinating and controversial in American history. It marked the transition from the politics of the 20th century's first half to the media-driven politics that would define the remainder of the century and beyond. It showed both the best and worst of American democracy, genuine competition of ideas and personalities alongside corruption and manipulation of the electoral process. It featured larger-than-life characters who would shape not just that moment, but decades to come. And it left us with enduring questions about the integrity of our elections and how we should respond when that integrity is called into doubt. The parallels to more recent elections are impossible to ignore. The 2000 election between George W. Bush and Al Gore came down to a handful of votes in Florida, with the Supreme Court ultimately deciding the outcome. The 2016 election saw Donald Trump win the Electoral College while losing the popular vote, leading to years of investigation into Russian interference. The 2020 election led to unprecedented challenges to the results, culminating in the January 6th attack on the Capitol. Each time Americans face a contested election, the example of 1960 resurfaces. Sometimes it's held up as a model of how candidates should behave, accepting results even when fraud is suspected. Other times, it's cited as evidence that election theft has happened before and can happen again. What lessons should we draw from 1960? Perhaps the most important is that election integrity matters immensely. When people lose faith in the fairness of elections, democracy itself is threatened. The fraud that occurred in Chicago and possibly Texas in 1960 was real and significant, even if we can't determine whether it changed the outcome. It eroded trust in the system. Modern election reforms, including better voter registration systems, improved ballot security, nonpartisan election officials, and transparent counting processes, all grew partly from recognition that the kinds of fraud possible in 1960 could not be allowed to continue. We also learned that television and media would forever change how campaigns are conducted. The importance of image, presentation, and media savvy became paramount. For better or worse, politics became more about personality and less about policy, more about performance and less about substance. Another lesson is that political machines and concentrated power are dangerous to democracy. The Chicago machine's ability to deliver votes, regardless of actual voter sentiment, showed how party organizations could subvert the popular will. The decline of such machines in the following decades was probably healthy for American democracy, even if it came with its own costs in terms of party discipline and organization. We also learned that sometimes pragmatism matters as much as principle. Nixon's decision not to contest the election, whatever his actual motivations, probably served the country well. A prolonged constitutional crisis in 1960 could have had terrible consequences. Sometimes the greater good requires accepting imperfect outcomes rather than fighting battles that can't be won. But perhaps the most sobering lesson is that some questions may never be answered definitively. We will probably never know with absolute certainty whether Kennedy legitimately won Illinois and Texas or whether fraud tipped the balance. The evidence is fragmentary, contradictory, and in some cases has been lost to history. We're left with a fascinating historical puzzle that scholars will likely debate for generations to come. And in a strange way, maybe that's okay. Maybe the uncertainty itself is instructive, reminding us that history is complex, that easy narratives are often incomplete, and that the truth is usually more nuanced than we'd like it to be. The story of Nixon's decision not to contest the 1960 election is ultimately a very human story. It's about ambition and calculation, principle and pragmatism, integrity and self-interest all mixed together. Nixon was not purely the selfless statesman he portrayed himself to be, but neither was he simply a bitter loser refusing to accept defeat. He was a complex man making difficult choices in impossible circumstances, trying to balance his own future against what he believed the country needed. Kennedy was not the untainted hero of Camelot, but neither was he simply a thief who stole the presidency. He was a skilled politician who understood power and how to obtain it, operating within a system where the lines between legitimate political organizing and corrupt manipulation were often blurred. The 1960 election shows us that democracy is messy, complicated, and sometimes morally ambiguous. It shows us that fraud can occur even in established democracies, that political machines can manipulate outcomes, and that not all wrongs can or should be righted. It shows us that sometimes accepting an imperfect result is better than tearing the country apart fighting over it. And it shows us that the decisions made by individuals in moments of crisis can echo through history in ways they never imagined. Richard Nixon's choice to concede an election he believed was stolen from him remains one of the most significant and debated decisions in modern American political history. Whether it was an act of statesmanship or calculated self-interest, whether Kennedy legitimately won or stole the election, these questions continue to fascinate us more than 60 years later, and they remain relevant today as we continue to grapple with questions of election integrity, political power, and the fragility of democratic norms. The truth is that elections are decided not just by voters, but by the systems that count votes, the machines that organize them, and the officials who certify them. When those systems fail or are corrupted, democracy itself is at risk. The 1960 election, whatever its actual outcome, exposed vulnerabilities in American democracy that took decades to address. Some would argue we're still addressing them today. In the end, the story of why Nixon refused to contest the 1960 election is not just about one man's decision or one election's outcome. It's about the nature of power, the requirements of leadership, the balance between fighting for what you believe is right and accepting outcomes for the greater good. It's about how democracies handle their worst moments and how individuals navigate impossible choices. It's a story that remains relevant today because the dilemmas it raises are eternal ones. When Nixon stood at that rostrum on January 6, 1961, and announced Kennedy's victory, he was making a choice that would define him in ways he couldn't fully anticipate. He was choosing to let go of what he believed was rightfully his, to accept defeat even in the face of fraud, to prioritize the appearance of democratic legitimacy over the pursuit of justice. Whether that choice was wise or foolish, noble or calculating, right or wrong, continues to be debated. But it was undeniably consequential, not just for Nixon himself, but for American democracy. And that's why, more than 60 years later, we're still talking about it. That's why the 1960 election remains one of the most analyzed, debated, and controversial in American history. Because it forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about our democracy, our values, and what we're willing to sacrifice to preserve the system we claim to cherish.